When a man holds his newborn for the first time, he realizes success was never the destination. Family was. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a peaceful and beautiful day. Today, we invite you to step into a quiet, heartfelt moment. The day a child comes into the world, a father's hands tremble with love, and a couple finds true happiness in the simplest things: home, warmth, and being together. If stories about family, love, and real-life emotions touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we share. The hallway outside labor and delivery was too bright for the hour, a strip of white light that made everything feel slightly unreal. Quang stood with his back to the wall, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned pale. The hospital bracelet on his wrist kept catching on his watch. He'd adjusted it twice already, as if small order could tame a day this big. A nurse stepped out to collect a signature. She smiled at him like she'd seen this 1,000 times. "Dad?" she said gently. The word landed in his chest. "We're close. She's doing great." Quang nodded, throat tight. He took the clipboard with careful hands, signed where she pointed, and handed it back. As the door swung inward again, he heard Linda's voice, thin, tired, stubborn. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably hers. He stepped into the room and went straight to her side. Linda lay with damp hair at her temples, cheeks flushed, eyes fixed on a point only she could see. She gripped the bed rail, released it, then gripped again. Quang stayed near her shoulder, close enough that she could feel him without having to turn. "Hey," he whispered, "I'm here." Linda's gaze flicked to him. Even exhausted, she managed a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Don't look so scared," she said, the sentence coming out in pieces. "I'm not scared," Quang lied. Her eyes held his for a second, as if she wanted to argue, then she let it go. She didn't have spare energy for his pride. She just needed him steady. The doctor spoke calmly. The nurse adjusted a cuff, checked a line. Quang watched Linda's face, how she listened, how she gathered herself again in small increments. He held her hand and felt her squeeze back with every bit of strength she had. "Okay," the doctor said. "That's it. One more." Linda shut her eyes. Her shoulders trembled. Quang leaned close, mouth near her ear. "You're doing it," he said. "You're already doing it." Linda opened her eyes again, anger flashing for a heartbeat, at pain, at the unfairness of bodies. Then the anger softened into determination. She nodded once. The room held its breath with her. And then a sound cut through everything, small, sharp, alive. A real cry, brief, offended, undeniable. Quang didn't react the way he thought he would. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He just froze, like his brain needed a second to understand that the sound belonged to their child. Linda's face changed first. The tension in her brow eased and her eyes filled, not with big tears, but with a bright sheen that made her look lit from within. She started, breathless. "He's here," the nurse said warmly. "Your baby's here." Quang watched hands move with gentle speed. Wipe, check, wrap. He saw a tiny fist uncurl and curl again, as if the baby was trying to grab onto the air. Linda reached out weakly, fingertips searching. Quang guided her hand closer. She touched the baby's cheek with one finger and smiled, exhausted and whole. "Hi," Linda whispered. Then the nurse turned toward Quang with a bundled weight in her arms. "Do you want to hold him?" Quang's first instinct was to say no. Not because he didn't want to, but because the request felt enormous, like being handed something made of glass. He stared at his own hands, hands that signed contracts and shook other men's hands in meetings. Suddenly they seemed too big. He began. "You can," Linda said softly. no pressure, just trust. The nurse showed him how to sit, how to keep his arms firm but gentle. Quang lowered himself into the chair as if gravity had changed. She placed the baby into the cradle of his forearms, and the room went quiet inside his head. The baby was warm and surprisingly heavy for something so small. His skin was slightly wrinkled, his hair damp against his scalp. His mouth opened and closed like he was tasting the world. Quang's arms locked with fear at first, then loosened when the baby settled. "Support the head," the nurse reminded him. "I am," Quang said too fast, and Linda exhaled a tired laugh. Quang looked down. The baby's eyes were barely open, unfocused and new. Quang felt something shift inside him. Not a rush, but a slow, certain drop, like a weight finally finding its place. "Hey," he murmured. His voice came out rough. "I'm your dad." The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry. Quang's mouth twitched, almost smiling. He glanced at Linda, still on the bed, still catching her breath, watching him like she was seeing him for the first time. "You did this," Quang said to her, and he meant it as awe. "You did all of it." Linda's eyelids drooped, then lifted again. "Bring him closer," she said. Quang stood carefully, every muscle paying attention. He stepped to the bed, and the nurse guided the baby into Linda's arms. Linda's hands shook, but her touch was sure in a way that surprised Quang. She held him against her chest, and the baby's cries softened, as if he recognized her heartbeat. Quang watched the curve of Linda's shoulder, the way her chin dipped to kiss the baby's forehead. He thought of all the things he'd tried to control in his life. Plans, schedules, perfect outcomes. None of that mattered in this quiet, messy room. Later, when the lights were dimmed and the room had settled, Linda lay on her side, recovering in small breaths. Quang sat beside her bed with his forearm on the mattress near her hand. The baby slept in the bassinet, face turned slightly, lips parted. Linda's fingers found Quang's and held on. "Are you okay?" he asked. Linda answered honestly. "I'm tired," she said, "but I'm okay." Quang nodded. He couldn't stop looking over at the bassinet. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," he admitted. Linda's thumb rubbed over his knuckle. "Me too," she said, "but we won't." A nurse came in briefly, checked the baby, checked Linda, then left as quietly as she'd arrived. Quang sat again, hands folded, eyes moving back to the bassinet like he needed proof every few seconds. "You're hovering," Linda whispered. Quang blinked. "I'm not hovering," Linda smiled. "You are." Quang exhaled, defeated. "Okay, maybe." Linda shifted carefully, wincing for a moment. Quang's hand lifted immediately, not touching her, just ready. "I'm fine," she murmured. "I know," he said. "I just want you comfortable." Linda looked at him for a long second, eyes soft. "You're doing good," she said quietly, "even if you're scared." Quang swallowed. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't want to mess him up." Linda squeezed his fingers. "Then don't do it alone," she said. "Just stay close." The baby stirred, making a tiny sound like a question. Quang stood and leaned over the bassinet, his finger hovering until the baby's fist wrapped around it with surprising strength. Quang's breath caught. That small grip held him like a promise. "Okay," he whispered. "I've got you." Morning arrived quietly, without ceremony. The light outside the hospital window shifted from gray to a soft, pale gold, the kind that made everything feel possible without demanding anything in return. Quang hadn't slept much. He'd dozed in fragments, waking every time the baby stirred, every time Linda shifted in the bed. Each time he checked that they were both still there. When the nurse came in with discharge papers, Quang stood up too fast, knocking his knee lightly against the chair. He didn't notice the sting. Linda watched him with a tired smile. "You're excited," she said. "I'm focused," he replied, but the corner of his mouth lifted. They dressed the baby slowly. Quang followed every instruction like it mattered more than any meeting he'd ever attended. He adjusted the tiny sleeves twice, careful not to bend the baby's arms the wrong way. Linda corrected him gently, her hands slower than usual but steady. "It's okay," she said. "He's not made of glass." Quang nodded, unconvinced. When it was time to leave, Quang carried the baby himself. He'd practiced the grip in his head all night. Linda walked beside him, one hand resting on his back, as if grounding them both. The hallway felt different now, less sterile, less intimidating. People passed them without knowing what they carried between them. Outside, the air was cool and clean. Quang paused for a second before opening the car door, looking down at the bundle in his arms. The baby slept through it all, unaware that the world had already changed. The drive home was quiet. Linda sat in the back, eyes on the baby the entire time. Quang drove slower than usual, braking early, turning carefully. Every bump in the road felt personal. "We're almost there," Linda said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Their house looked the same from the outside, but when Quang unlocked the door, it felt like stepping into a new place. The air was still, waiting. He carried the baby inside first, then came back for Linda, holding the door wide, guiding her gently. Linda sat on the couch with a sigh that carried relief and exhaustion. Quang placed the baby down in the bassinet they'd set up weeks ago, then stood back, hands on his hips, scanning the room like he was seeing it for the first time. "It's dusty," he said suddenly. Linda raised an eyebrow. "It was dusty yesterday, too." "It's different now," Quang said. "We should clean." Linda laughed quietly. "Quang, sit down." He didn't. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and started with the coffee table, wiping it down with more care than necessary. He moved methodically, picking things up, putting them back neater, more intentional. He opened windows to let in fresh air, adjusted the thermostat, rearranged cushions. Linda watched from the couch, the baby in her arms now, nursing slowly. "You're nesting," she teased. "I'm making space," Quang replied. "He needs good air, good light." Linda didn't argue. She just watched him move around their home, this man who once thrived on chaos now finding comfort in order. When the baby finished feeding and fell asleep again, Linda rested her head against the back of the couch. Quang noticed immediately and came over, placing a blanket over her legs. "Lie down," he said. "In a minute," she murmured. "I like sitting here." Quang sat beside her, careful not to jostle the baby. They stayed that way for a while, saying nothing. The house hummed softly around them. Later, Quang stood at the kitchen counter reading the instructions on a box of baby bottles like they were legal documents. He washed each one carefully, lined them up on a clean towel and let them air dry. He checked the water temperature twice before testing it on his wrist. Linda leaned against the doorway, watching him. "You're going to be exhausted," she said. "I already am," Quang replied. "But it's fine." She crossed the room slowly and kissed his shoulder. "You don't have to do everything." "I know," he said. "I just want to do something." That night, the baby cried. Not loudly, just enough to announce his needs. Quang was on his feet instantly, almost tripping over the rug. "I've got him," Linda said, already sitting up. Quang hesitated, then nodded, hovering nearby. He watched as Linda adjusted her grip, murmured softly, her voice low and soothing. The baby quieted, his small body relaxing against hers. Quang felt something loosen in his chest. He sat back down, rubbing his face with his hands. "You okay?" Linda asked. "Yeah," he said. I didn't know love could feel this constant." Linda smiled. "It doesn't stop," she said. "That's the part they don't tell you." Later, when the baby slept again, Quang lay awake beside Linda, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked softly, settling. He listened to the rhythm of their breathing, the small sounds of a new life adjusting. "I used to think I needed more," he said quietly. Linda turned her head toward him. "More what?" "More success, more control, more proof that I was doing something right." He paused. "Now it feels like everything else can wait." Linda reached for his hand. "It can," she said. "We're here." In the days that followed, time lost its sharp edges. Mornings blended into afternoons, naps into feedings. Quang learned the language of small cries, the difference between hunger and discomfort. He changed diapers with growing confidence, laughing when he got it wrong. Linda healed slowly, resting when she could. She watched Quang become a father in real time, saw the way he softened without losing himself. They spoke in whispers, shared looks across the room, communicated without words. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting warm shapes on the floor. Linda sat on the rug, the baby on her chest. Quang lay beside them, propped on one elbow, tracing the outline of the baby's tiny ear with his finger. "He's perfect," Quang said. Linda nodded. "He's ours." Quang leaned down and kissed Linda's hair, then the baby's forehead. The baby stirred, then settled again, trusting without question. The house felt full, not loud, not crowded, just full in the quietest, most lasting way. Quang rested his head on the floor, closed his eyes, and let himself stay there, exactly where he was.
Xin chào. Trong cái lạnh cắt da của vùng cao, Linda lủi thủi một mình trên nương sắn, quanh quẩn với đàn gà, đàn vịt, căn nhà sàn cũ kỹ. Lòng lúc nào cũng thấy cô đơn, mặc cảm và bị cảm giác bị bỏ rơi. Đúng lúc đó, Quang trở về, lo lắng dặn cô không được đi vào những nơi vực sâu nguy hiểm và hứa sẽ bù đắp cho những thiếu thốn của cô. Vài ngày sau, Quang cùng người khiêng lên một chiếc tủ gỗ lớn, chắc chắn đặt giữa căn nhà sàn, giúp Linda lần đầu được treo gọn quần áo, chăn màn như một người thực sự có nhà. Anh xin nghỉ làm, ở lại chăm sóc, cùng nấu ăn với cô, chẻ củi, trò chuyện mỗi tối. Chiếc tủ mới dần trở thành biểu tượng cho tương lai vững chắc và sợi dây gắn kết âm thầm giữa hai người. Mọi người hãy like, share và subscribe để ủng hộ giúp mình nhé.